Science is not about finding truth, it is about disproving truth, isn't it?
Truth is not a revelation that is handed down to us once and for all by higher authorities.
Gender, generally, is a social construct. This is a very scary idea for a lot of people.
Human beings are real things. They're not just social constructs.
Science, in the 19th century, gave us this thing called scientific racism.
The problem is not science. The problem is collectivism.
There is no correspondence between language and truth.
Language is just a game, and you manipulate logic, you manipulate evidence, you use any rhetorical trick in order to advance your group's value judgment.
Morality to me is a form of superstition.
Progress has been real. The status of women, the status of gays, the status of blacks, and all of the other races.
I never speak the truth. I'm telling stories, and you can like them or not. I don't think they're any more true than any other story about the Holocaust or about World War II.
Michel Foucault said, "I am simply a Nietzschean." And what we do know about Nietzsche is a ruthless power politics all the way down. You don't get individual liberty out of that.
Tonight's resolution reads, postmodernism is necessary for a politics of individual liberty. And again, I want to bring on, arguing for the affirmative, Thaddeus Russell. Thaddeus, please take to the stage. And arguing the negative, Stephen Hicks. Please, Stephen, please come to the stage. Since Thaddeus is arguing for the negative, he will lead off. You have 15 minutes to tell us why postmodernism is what you claim it to be. Take it away.
I'm actually arguing for the affirmative, so that's okay. I make mistakes too. And the good thing is, since I'm a postmodernist, that doesn't matter. It's just about being interesting, not being right. So let's start at a really important moment in history, 1961. I think is a great moment for freedom, individual freedom. This was the year in which two books were published. One by this guy named Michel Foucault, this terrible French philosopher who everyone hates. He wrote a book called Madness and Civilization, which was simply a history of the asylum in Europe and North America, in which he talked about what I think might be the worst use of state power against human beings, or the worst abuse of state power of human beings in history, if you think about it. As you may know, after World War II, and even before then, but certainly after World War II, many people were locked up in these asylums, which were essentially prisons for the so-called mentally insane. Now, do we know who those people were? Were they just schizophrenics? No. It included women who were simply promiscuous or who sold sex, and it included people who were known as free thinkers, people who were simply dissidents, people who even believed in things like opposition to war, people who believed in free markets sometimes. Anyone who's thought outside of the dominant discourse of the time tended to be locked up in these kinds of places and reformed by being sedated, sometimes being sterilized, sometimes having electroshock given to them, or lobotomized, if none of that worked. This is pretty bad stuff. So what that was all based on, the justification for doing this to these people, was these claims made by medical scientists. Medical scientists at the Sorbonne, at Harvard, at Columbia, at UC Berkeley, and at Stanford, and at Oxford and Cambridge. Medical scientists using the scientific method studied a bunch of people and said, oh, well, if you have these ideas about politics, or if you're a woman and has these bad desires and sleeps around with women, or if you simply are something that we don't want in our society because you are weird or different, we're going to have to do something to you, put you away and reform you and assimilate you into the dominant norms of our society so that you can get along here. And many of those people never left those places, right? I actually used to live in Salem, Oregon, which is the home place of the mental hospital that is famous for being the site of the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest movie. That was fun. That was fun. They were doing lobotomies and electroshock into the 1980s there. Now again, these were psychiatrists, medical professionals, scientists telling the courts, you need to go there, you need to go there, you need to go there. And many of these people, most of these people were not schizophrenics. They were actually people like me. They were like people like you, too. If you have divergent ideas, or had divergent ideas from the dominant norms, you were very likely to be locked up in one of those places. Foucault then later wrote a history of the prison similarly, right? He said that it wasn't just people who were bad or criminals or were violent, it was people who were simply different, eccentric, crazy in all sorts of ways. In that very same year, in 1961, the year that Foucault's Madness and Civilization came out, another book was published by a man named Thomas Szasz. We are familiar with this? Right. And that book was called The Myth of Mental Illness. Now, he didn't make exactly the same argument as Foucault, but it was a very similar argument. He said that these ideas about mental illness were really just myths. They were made up. They were made up by the state. They were made up by scientists. They were made up by medical professionals, and they were used to punish people who were simply aberrant, displayed aberrant behaviors in 1961. 1961, very important date. The next year, another really good year, was 1962. This was the year that Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions came out. Now, this argument was revolutionary, and this was really in many ways the beginning of postmodernism in some ways. It argued that science has changed. Scientific truth constantly changes. Science is not about finding truth. It is about disproving truth, isn't it? Any scientist you know should be a postmodernist. In fact, the real scientists, I think, are all postmodernists. They always say this. We're never finding truth. We're simply disproving claims about truth, right? So Thomas Kuhn said, well, look at the history of science. Again, just like Foucault. Look at the history of a truth claim. Anytime you hear a truth claim, just read the history of it. And Foucault and Kuhn said, in every case, here's the thing. There is a history. There is a history. These claims, these ideas about truth, or truth itself, doesn't come out of nature. It doesn't come out of God. In every case, you simply look at the history, and you can find that there was a point in time where women who were promiscuous were considered to be crazy and needed to be locked up. There was a time right then when people who were considered to be homosexual, or were homosexuals, were considered to be crazy and needed to be locked up. As you may know, homosexuality until 1973 was officially designated by the American Psychiatric Association as a pathology. And many homosexuals were locked up in those cages, in those mental asylums, and sterilized, lobotomized, and sedated. Thomas Kuhn said, science is always changing its mind, all the time. We are 1 minute completely convinced as a society that something is true, like the fact, back in the day, that the sun revolved around the earth. Everyone just knew that was true. And if you disbelieved that, if you even were skeptical about that claim, what happened to you? What happened to you? Very bad things, because that was challenging truth that was supported by the church and the state. And it was universally agreed that the sun revolved around the earth. That was the Ptolemaic system, right? Then this guy named Copernicus came along and said, not so much. Maybe the earth revolves around the sun. Big trouble for him. Big trouble for anybody who believed this, right? And then Galileo got his problems too when he followed up on that idea. So again, there's an arrogance here. At every moment in history, we as a society there's a consensus around what is true and what is not, right? And then a few years later, we change our minds entirely about it. So 1 minute, everyone's convinced that the sun revolves around the earth, and the next minute, everyone is convinced just the opposite. How do we know today that we are right even about that, if we were so wrong about it before? Back in the day, not even that long ago, we considered this to be completely solid, right? Completely solid. No space in there. Well, what do we think now? There's atoms and there's spaces between them. This is as full of holes as it is of hard matter, solid matter, right? Completely radical idea that could have gotten you burned at the stake or thrown in a prison or an asylum. Are we convinced now that these scientific truths are true forever? And when I say truth, that is a claim about something being universal, everywhere, eternal, always, and applying to all people. That's a heavy claim to make in any case, right? So Kuhn really pulled the rug under from that, and people started to follow that in postmodernist theory. Jacques Derrida, the most evil man on earth, according to Jordan Peterson, later in the 1960s began writing several books and articles in which he argued that there is no correspondence between language and truth. There was a common belief, it's still pretty common now, that we can ascertain, we can arrive at, we can find truth through language. Is that true? Is that true? He said, no, not so much, because language always changes, and all the words refer to every other word. When you look in a dictionary at synonyms of words, what do you find? You find just word after word after word describing the other words. There is no end to it. There is no word that is closer to the truth than any other in this case. Now, what was Derrida inspired by? He was inspired, like Foucault, by the abuses of government by the state in the 20th century. And in fact, he said his inspiration for inventing the idea of deconstructing language and texts and showing that there are internal contradictions and that there is no absolute correspondence between language or words and truth. It came from rejecting these claims made by governments that, with the use of scientists, that things like, Jews are vermin, right? Or women who are aberrant and don't behave properly need to be locked up, or that blacks are biologically inferior to whites. These are language claims about truth that needed to be deconstructed. That was his impetus, was actually an opposition to state abuses of power through language. You don't have a law without norms and language upholding them, which involve truth claims. So that is, to me, the origins of what should have been an alliance between lovers of personal liberty and these so-called postmodernists. But it didn't happen, unfortunately. Then, later in the 1970s, we had the advent of postmodernist feminism, which said that, again, women and gender generally is a social construct. This is a very scary idea for a lot of people. But if you think about it, gender has changed. What it means to be a woman has changed over time. It changes constantly. What it means to be a man has changed constantly. The ideal feminine has changed constantly. The ideal masculine has changed constantly across time, across history, and across space. Different countries, different societies think of these things differently and always have. And even in this country, we have changed radically in our views of what is a good and proper and ideal man and a good and proper and ideal woman. They're contingent. They're contingent. They are not eternal. That means that they come from the minds of human beings, not from nature or God. In 1979, Jean-François Lyotard, another terrible French postmodernist, argued against these, what he called meta-narratives. These claims that there are currents in history that just are ineluctable, that they happen regardless, that they are not contingent, that, in particular, progress is inevitable, right? This is sort of the Whiggish idea of history, that the further we go along, the better we get. Well, here's the thing. These guys, all of them, were born in the mid-20th century, right? And so they saw what happened. They saw what happened in the 20th century. What happened in the 20th century? This was the culmination of Enlightenment scientific thinking, wasn't it? World War II. This was the mobilization of scientists and engineers to build all those tanks and bombs and airplanes that killed 65 million people just in one war. Same thing in World War I. That was the use of scientific knowledge to wreak terrible havoc on massive populations. So, we began to question science itself. It can be useful, it can build bridges, and it can build airplanes, but it can also build tanks that can drive across those bridges to lay waste to villages. It can also build atomic bombs that are dropped from those airplanes. Science and the Enlightenment can bring the best, and it can bring the worst. It is not just a forward progress. It is not just good, and it is not a religion. The idea that scientists and science should be respected and revered and believed on its face is possibly the most dangerous belief system ever. They said, and I agree. If we simply agree that scientists are always right, then they were right about eugenics. They were right about scientific racism. They were right about scientific sexism. They were right about some of the worst horrors that have ever been visited on human beings in history. These are all scientific projects. The idea of mental illness as a pathology, of aberrant behavior as a pathology, again, that was invented by medical professionals and scientists in the name of science. So we must always be skeptical of science. Don't reject it. This is another thing that's confused about postmodernism. No postmodernist that says don't listen to science. Don't ever fly in an airplane. It's very useful within the sphere we live in the world we live in. But always be skeptical. And whenever anyone makes a claim about any truth claim, any truth that is rooted in nature or God, be careful and maybe reach for your gun. Then there was a confusion, and I have 2 minutes to try to do this quickly, that was really tragic for me and very frustrating. This is why I'm talking about these days. In 2016, sorry, I should say 2013, there was this new beast created, this thing called the social justice warrior on college campuses. These are the people running around saying, I was born with a penis, but I was also born a man. And that means X, Y, and Z about me. You, on the other hand, were born a cis, white, male, and that means X, Y, and Z about you. These were essentialist claims. This was a repudiation of postmodernism. This is the opposite of postmodernism. When you are told that you are such and such because of your body and how you were born, that is what the old conservatives used to do. So the SJWs were a repudiation of postmodernism. But a couple of Canadian professors, nonetheless, started talking about how what's going on in college campuses is the result of this thing called postmodernism. This guy named Jordan Peterson, whose mentor on this subject is this man right here, have argued that that is the root of these things, but actually it's just the opposite. It is conflict. Conflict between that politics and what I've been calling postmodernism. So I urge you to vote in favor of the proposition. Libertarianism and postmodernism are a marriage that could result in a brand new movement that could bring real freedom. Thanks.